this episode of Tank Showcase, we take a look at the British Tier 5 heavy tank, the Churchill Infantry tank. It was designed and built according to how the British believed tanks should be used for a war that never happened, and had to fight to survive in a war that did. The original designs for the Churchill Infantry tank came about after the end of the First World War. The British believed that they needed a tank capable of excelling in breaking through trench warfare. It needed to be able to cross shell-cratered ground, clear barbed wire, and lay the path for following infantry. The earliest designs actually had two side sponsons, much like World War I Mark I tanks. And indeed, when you take a closer look at the Churchill, you can still see many similarities, such as the long track base, steel tracks, and their front sloping. This was designed specifically for crushing barbed wire. 4 prototypes of the A-20 were completed by Harland and Wolff shipbuilders, famous for ships such as HMS Belfast, which can be visited in London, and the Titanic, which can't. On the outbreak of World War II, new specifications were drawn up which led to the A-22 Infantry Tank Mark IV. Early tanks were affected by terrible reliability.
Bail out! This vehicle has had it!
We are often told that Churchill tank failed at the Dieppe landings in 1942. Most tellingly, when the Germans were able to inspect the abandoned tanks on the Dieppe beach, they saw them as obsolete or discarded designs that the British had chosen to waste. It was only once the Churchill got to North Africa where its advantages started to show through. Suddenly, this almost obsolete tank was found to be able to scale incredibly steep slopes and support infantry in the mountainous terrain of Tunisia with a new and effective 6-pounder gun. Furthermore, it was found to be almost impervious to most Axis anti-tank fire of the time. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, one Churchill is said to have survived more than 80 hits. It was during the Battle of Longstop Hill, on the 21st of April 1943, that Churchill tanks of the 48th Royal Tank Regiment got the better of a new German Tiger tank, jamming the turret and causing the crew to abandon the vehicle, thereby presenting the British with a complete, intact, and working Tiger 1. This was Tiger 131, which can be found at the Bovington Tank Museum. The Churchill tank indeed proved itself to be incredibly useful, and it was one of the most adapted tanks of the war, with variants including Churchill Mark I, Churchill Mark II, Churchill Mark II CS, Churchill Mark III, Churchill Mark IV, Churchill Mark V, Mark VI, Mark VII and 8, Mark IX, Mark X, Mark XI, the Churchill NA-75, the Churchill AVRE, the Churchill ARV, the ARK, the bridge layer, the gun carrier, the flail or toad, the goat, the kangaroo, the oak, and the Churchill crocodile. In World of Tanks, meanwhile, many of these variants have simply been pushed together into the British Tier 5 heavy tank, Churchill 1, the Tier 6 Churchill 7, and the British Tier 6 tank destroyer, the Churchill gun carrier, along with the Russian premium heavy, the Churchill 3. They are all characterised by their large size and relative sluggishness. So what does that mean in game? Well, you're big and slow. That pretty much sums it up. I mean, there's not much more else to say about that. You're a big, slow tank. You do have a good gun though. I mean, it's once you can get the 75mm, there's pretty good accuracy, and you can take some quite nice aimed shots at range. But really, ultimately, the thing holding you back is going to be your mobility. You have to decide very early on where you're going to fight, where you think you're going to need to fight, and you need to get to that position. And it's all the more frustrating because you often get to that position and you realise that the fight isn't there. When you do get into the fight though, you can be quite a force to be reckoned with for tanks of the same tier and lower. Now, you want to avoid them getting round to the sides, and the other thing to be worried about is actually it's relatively easy to be detracked. Your front sprockets are very much exposed, and with the turret positioned right in the centre of the hull, you really do have to expose a lot of your tank when fighting around corners. I am in a heavy tank, but I'm not the most heavily armoured tank. That one probably is the most heavily armoured tank, and there's probably the problem with the Churchill these days, is now the Japanese heavies, the Churchill Mark 1 and to some extent the Churchill Mark 3 premium tank are, well, pretty much obsolete. This Churchill tank is Jackal, and along with Tiger, Jaguar and Rook, formed the staff platoon for the 2nd Squadron of the 4th Battalion of the Coldstream Guards, which supported the infantry attack at the Battle of Overloon in the Netherlands before it ran over a German mine. John Collier, from Churchill tank Cheetah of 2nd Squadron, recounts, "I was alongside the Churchill tank the Jackal when it blew up. My old mate Bob Dare was on that tank, and unfortunately we were unable to stop. I was convinced that Bob was dead." Bob, however, was not dead. He recounts his story in a letter to Bill Hutchinson, previously of the Market Garden Veterans Association. He says, "I remember getting ready for the attack during the morning. My crew were made up of Garner, the commander, myself, the driver, Bob Silman and Gordon Wright, the turretman, and my co-driver, Johnny Lambert. Johnny only came to join us the day before, from another tank which had been blown up, and my original co-driver had received injuries which made it impossible for him to take part in any action. We had the order to move out, and steadily drove up this small lane, line astern. We were being shelled mercilessly by moaning minis. The days before were bad, but things were worse. Then we had the order to turn left, clear through hedges and woods, and proceed over open ground in V formation. I was the lead tank. The tank on my left had been hit, but we were ordered to carry on. A few minutes later, my tank was lifted up in the air by a huge explosion. Smoke and flames filled the tank, and Garner shouting, 'Out!' My clothes were burning, and blood was coming from somewhere." Bob describes how he crawled out of the tank and to the rear for cover, where he found none of his friends. He could see that the co-driver's hatch was still closed, so Bob, presumably now having put his flaming clothes out, decided to go back into the still burning tank, where he undid his co-driver's hatch and pushed him out. He describes Johnny Lambert as unconscious and burning. "I went round to Johnny's side and dragged him away. Away from the tank and smoke, I noticed he had no legs. His right one was completely severed near the ankle and hanging on by a piece of his denims. Having pulled his co-driver to safety, Bob unbelievably returned once again to his burning tank, climbed onto the deck, and he was able to reach Garner, the tank commander. He tells us, he was burning. His hands were black, but I managed to drag him free, dropped him onto the engine cover, which was red hot, and dropped over the back of the tank before dragging him beside Johnny Lambert. They both laid still. I thought they had both died. I had a look at Garner, and the front of his body had a huge hole in it. A piece had been torn out. I wanted to return to help Gordon and Bob, but was stopped because, little did I know, I was walking around in a minefield." Bob Dare suffered severe burns in the explosion, and no doubt in returning to the burning tank to save his crew. The tank commander, Garner, suffered burns and lost a leg, whilst co-driver Johnny Lambert lost both legs. Robert Silman and Gordon Wright lost their lives. Bob Dare tells us, "I have returned several times over the years to pay homage to them and to ask them for forgiveness for not being able to help them get out of the turret. Their cries for help are still with me today." Well, to be honest, after that, I don't feel much like playing games. Until next time, you've been oinked.